Hi, this is the Cartoon Koala. You probably didn't expect to hear my voice again so soon. It's usually at least a month between scripted videos, but I'm here for what I'm expecting to be a quick rant/ramble about something that's really come to my attention recently. Though as you may know, my videos almost always end up being much longer than I expect them to be. So, who knows, this might actually be like 30 minutes instead of 10 minutes like I planned. But back on track, as the title implies, that something that has come to my attention is, to put it simply, what the heck happened to Cartoon Network? Part 1. What once was. Now it's kind of funny since my last video was about a man who started his career with Cartoon Network rants. Like 15 years ago at this point. And yeah, it's pretty well known that back in the late 2000s, Cartoon Network was also in a pretty rough spot. Pretty much all of their original cartoons from before then were ending. Their new cartoons, while your opinion on them may vary, they certainly weren't as popular as their old ones. They started to seem more reliant on foreign imports to fill their animated lineup. And most infamously, the Cartoon Network started to import and produce live-action programming. Yes, it seems that constantly being in third place behind Nick and Disney ratings-wise was finally getting to them. Surely this would be the way to finally tap into that coveted tween market that Nick and Disney Channel had managed to dominate with their lineups of live-action sitcoms. That Cartoon Network's formerly strong lineup of iconic and high-quality cartoons had struggled to attract, despite ironically often being far more intelligent and sophisticated than these live-action kidcoms. This peaked in 2009 when the Cartoon Network didn't premiere a single original cartoon, but instead premiered a 2-hour block consisting entirely of live-action reality shows, most of which were deemed rip-offs of pre-existing reality shows. A block that's name strikes fear in the hearts of cartoon fans everywhere: CN Real. Though unlike Nickelodeon, which went through a similar phase at the time, Cartoon Network was just as famously able to pick itself back up. Nickelodeon was able to rely on SpongeBob and Dan Schneider alone to keep them afloat. Cartoon Network didn't have a show like SpongeBob to always fall back on. Or at least, unlike Nick, they had the integrity to let their show of similar popularity actually end on its own terms.
At a certain point, Cartoon Network came to us and said, well, what about 7? What about a 7th season? And Chris and I both said, no, I think it's time. It's over with. It had its run. It kind of ran its course. And we would hate to continue making a show when we're just kind of hitting the same notes and repeating ourselves. And we wanted to kind of go out while it still was good.
Though in hindsight, it seems like they might have just been playing the long game. CN Real completely bombed, being demoted from Wednesdays and Saturdays to only Wednesday nights. Only 2 of its 6 shows continued after 2009, and the block itself lasted just under a year. It was clear that for this network to continue, it was gonna have to put its faith back into what the channel's original programming was originally built on: fresh and innovative animation. And at the start of the new decade, that's exactly what they did. I'm not going to pretend that of the big 3 networks, Cartoon Network was the one I watched the most. It definitely wasn't. I probably watched more SpongeBob and Phineas and Ferb alone than all of Cartoon Network's originals combined. But of the 3, it was definitely the one that seemed the most appealing to me as a young lad. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is, to put it simply, I very much had a vendetta against live-action shows. Subconsciously, it was probably partially me, even at a young age, noticing the lack of quality in Nick and Disney's kidcoms. But I think you can also blame it on the fact that the majority of these shows very much felt marketed towards girls, with most of them either starring a female lead, or if it was male-led, the male leads always acted as eye candy to the little girls in the audience. Either way, they could always sing, and they always had a new song or album out that the network would market endlessly. Maybe subconsciously I also noticed the shameless advertising. But because of this, I always kind of associated live action shows as girl stuff and cartoons as boy stuff, thus making Cartoon Network seem like the perfect safe haven for little boys like myself. It helped that the majority of their shows at the time were male-led. Yeah, I think we can blame the Disney Channel when brain-dead network execs try to say that animation doesn't sell as well to girls as live action, since they were the ones who pretty much invented this model, and Nickelodeon was just kind of copying them. Ironic, since Disney and animation go pretty much hand in hand, and Disney is known for heavily marketing many of its animated movies to little girls. But back on topic. It's not like Nick and Disney didn't have any cartoons, but with Cartoon Network, cartoons were top priority, though they would actually continue experimenting with live action shows until 2012. But after CNReal, they managed to keep them mostly in the background, and even then they seemed more male skewing. A second and just as shallow reason is that my parents were pretty strict when it came to what I watched on TV, so I didn't actually get to watch a ton of Cartoon Network shows, including most of their really popular ones, that often. And I think we all know that a lot of the time, especially as a kid, when you're told not to do something, it just makes you want to do it more, especially when there doesn't seem to be any good reason for it, and when everyone else is doing it. Dang, you'd swear I was talking about doing drugs or something, not watching freaking Cartoon Network. But yeah, I made it so whenever I was able to get some viewing time in, it felt really special. And also made Cartoon Network seem more grown up than the other big two, which in some ways it kind of was.
Oh, man, it's almost 8. We're not gonna find him, let's just eat it.
No. Benson's gonna get pissed, so we shouldn't.
Did that Blue Jay just say the P word? On a kid's show?
But third and foremost is that Cartoon Network didn't just have these other channels beat in terms of the quantity of their cartoons, but their quality and how they presented them. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that Nickelodeon didn't premiere a single good cartoon during the 2010s decade. There were a few, but rarely were they allowed to thrive in the way that Cartoon Network's originals were at the time, seemingly due to Nick holding them to the impossibly high standards of their long-time #1 show in terms of ratings. They would often have their final episodes unceremoniously dumped on Nick's sister network, Nicktoons, a premium cable channel, meaning not as many people could watch them. A channel which in the early 2010s was starting to market itself more towards boys. Disney released many a great cartoon in the 2010s, but very similar to Nickelodeon, most of them were relegated to the Disney Channel's male-centered sister channel, Disney XD. Once again, intentionally or not, enforcing the notion that cartoons are for boys and live-action shows are for girls. This was seemingly less of an attempt to kill off underperforming shows, but more so an attempt to attract more viewership to the struggling sister channel. But still, it's funny to think that Disney, of all companies, was not allowing animation to thrive on its main channel. Minus Phineas and Ferb, I guess. Yeah, Nickelodeon and Disney Channel were pretty much identical at this point in their history. A bunch of girly tween sitcoms, their one golden child that they slap on all kinds of merchandise.
Hey kids, it's SpongeBob SquarePants!
And then maybe one or two other cartoons that only existed to fill a time slot. Funnily enough though, it wasn't until 2012 that Nickelodeon fell behind Disney Channel in terms of ratings, which was probably the peak of their Disney envy. For the first time in 17 years, Nickelodeon was no longer the highest rated cable channel. Both Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network learned the hard way that following the crowd doesn't always yield good results, and in fact can yield disastrous results. So it's probably a good idea that after CNReal, Cartoon Network stopped trying to copy its peers and instead went back to doing its own thing. For the first half of the decade, it felt like Cartoon Network was constantly pumping out these bold, original cartoons that rivaled their shows from decades before. Cartoons with innovative animation and storytelling. Cartoons that often did have an edge to them, humor and story-wise, that distinguished them from the squeaky clean shows of their peers. Cartoons that managed to gain a broad audience ranging from kids to adults. Shows like Adventure Time, Regular Show, The Amazing World of Gumball, Steven Universe is a show I've barely watched, but a lot of people love it. Even shows that people hated, like Uncle Grandpa and Clarence. Those shows slapped. I don't know what you people were talking about. And on top of their originals, also at this point, being owned by Warner Brothers seemed like an advantage, since they were able to incorporate Warner Brothers' own animated shows to give more variety to the lineup, often providing fresh takes on their old properties. Of course, there were duds, like Problem Solvers and Secret Mountain Fort Awesome. Pure action cartoons pretty much died during this period. Like I said, they were still experimenting with live action shows in the background, but I think part of the charm of that 2010 to 2012 era of Cartoon Network was that it was so experimental. And the nature of experimentation is that it doesn't always succeed. And yet there was a level of cohesion and brand identity that separated it from Nick and Disney, whose shows often felt interchangeable from each other. And overall, by 2014, things were looking far better for this channel than they had 5 years earlier. For that brief period, Cartoon Network really seemed to live up to its old slogan, as the best place for cartoons. At least in terms of cable channels. Not just for the viewers, but seemingly also for the creators, who seemed to be given a lot of freedom over there. Their cartoons were so successful that they seemed to spawn some copycats. I mean, just look at shows from rival networks like Sanjay and Craig, Breadwinners, and Pickle and Peanut, which, regardless if it's truly the case, very much felt like the result of a bunch of corporate suits trying to replicate the success of shows like Adventure Time, Regular Show, and Gumball, but thought that all you needed was a flashy, brightly colored show starring two
totally gnarly dudes, man,
who spout catchphrases and rap lyrics and fart jokes and random old video game references and make hell for those around them. Without realizing what actually made those shows popular was that they had well-written characters and clever writing. It's pretty well known that before being sold to Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon rejected Adventure Time twice. So this might have been Nickelodeon kicking themselves for their horrible mistake. Though, let's be real, if Adventure Time had been sold to Nickelodeon, it probably wouldn't have been allowed to thrive like it did on Cartoon Network, and would have probably been a very different show from what it became. So, what happened then? Well, a lot of people would probably pin the blame for Cartoon Network's second and somehow worse downfall on the surprising popularity of a certain show that wasn't even produced by their main studio. A show that, in stark contrast to most of Cartoon Network's other programming at the time, was beloved by kids but hated by older fans, albeit not necessarily for the best reasons. A show that would frequently mock its critics. Part 2.
Teen Titans Go! Your new favorite show!
A reimagining of a beloved show from Cartoon Network's past that was almost nothing like the original. It premiered in 2013 and was a smash hit with kids, but despised by older fans, mostly just for being such a departure from the old show. But it didn't start to become noticeably oversaturated until around 2015, and Cartoon Network really seemed to start giving it the same treatment Nickelodeon had been given SpongeBob, with it consistently taken up half their schedule, constant advertisement, again with that obnoxious slogan, and the channel finding any excuse to marathon it, even if it meant overshadowing their other, more well-liked cartoons, both old and new. Even the shows that were actually produced in-house. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't hate Teen Titans Go. I loved it when it first came on, and before I saw a bunch of angry cartoon fans online telling me it was a disgrace to animation. Even now, I just kind of find it a mediocre and loud cartoon with repetitive humor and stories and inconsistent characters that can still occasionally be genuinely clever and funny. I don't think it deserved nearly the widespread vitriolic backlash that it got.
My childhood has been raped so many times by Cartoon Network that I think it should be a registered sex offender.
And in many ways, it felt like everyone was feeding the trolls with this one. You can't tell me that the creators weren't intentionally trying to fuel the fire with all those critic call-out episodes, and that the marketing team wasn't intentionally trying to piss off the show's haters when dubbing it your new favorite show. Still, this treatment was absolutely ridiculous. And Cartoon Network was starting to look a bit more like its competition. A lot of people compare it to Cartoon Network's treatment of Johnny Test, another despised non-Cartoon Network original, a few years before, but just looking at some old schedules, I don't see a point where it was ever this bad. It didn't help people's faith in the network when around the same time Teen Titans Go Mania was hitting its peak. Cartoon Network started premiering more reboots of their old shows that felt like big departures from the originals, had drastically different art styles, and were despised by fans, like Ben 10 in 2017, and the Powerpuff Girls in 2016, made without any involvement from the original creator, and also without the original voice actresses for some reason, and with random dated memes and little girls twerking, and lame attempts at social commentary, and crappy animation, and yeah, it was pretty bad. It's especially frustrating when you continue to see other Cartoon Network creators come forward wanting to reboot their shows only to get shut down. I wonder what it was that set these two shows apart from those others.
Merchandising! Merchandising!
It wouldn't be the first time Cartoon Network prioritized that. People would also lump in Be Cool Scooby-Doo with these shows due to it being a reboot of an old property with a weird art style and more comedic tone. Even though it wasn't produced by Cartoon Network's main studio, aired most of its episodes on Cartoon Network's sister channel, Boomerang, which was just starting to enter its own weird phase at this point, focusing more on recent shows as opposed to reruns of classics, and has since gained a bit of a cult following, which is more than can be said about these other divisive reboots. People would also often lump in Mighty Magosaurs with this, despite not being based on a pre-existing show unless you count the web shorts. But it was flash animation with bright colors and random XD type humor, so sure, I guess it counts. And it was around this time you started to see people say Cartoon Network was entering another dark age. And you could certainly draw parallels between this period and Cartoon Network's previous dark age in the late 2000s, with them oversaturated in one type of show, just instead of live action, it was now crappy reboots and or random XD shows. It also didn't help when around this time we were also finding out that pretty much all of Cartoon Network's original shows from beforehand would be ending somewhat soon. Adventure Time, Regular Show, Gumball, Uncle Grandpa, Clarence, all entering their last few seasons. The future didn't look bright for the channel, and I can see why people thought history was repeating itself. Though it is funny in hindsight to think that people thought that oversaturation of reboots and or random XD shows would be a factor in a network's downfall, since none of the aforementioned shows held a candle to Teen Titans Go in terms of popularity and oversaturation. Especially funny since around this same time, people thought that Nickelodeon was improving, because it had one animated hit that people actually liked, and maybe a couple other good cartoons that ultimately were given the shaft, and the former show has been driven into the ground by them, much like their previous animated hits.
Womp 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 womp.
There was never a full-blown CN Real moment, Like a year where Cartoon Network premiered a bunch of reboots and or random XD shows, and not a single good and or original cartoon. Simultaneously, Cartoon Network was still producing high quality original cartoons that did manage to find their audiences. The truth was that the real money just wasn't in cable TV anymore, but in streaming. The fans of these shows were now much less likely to tune into them live, so it made sense that most cable channels, not just Cartoon Network, started deciding to play it safe by mostly airing reruns of their few most popular shows. So really, it wasn't Teen Titans Go, or reboots or random XD shows in general, that would kill the network, but streaming. Part 3, HBO Max. In 2018, Time Warner, Cartoon Network's parent company, was bought by AT&T, with the purpose of launching a streaming service built around Warner's extensive back catalog. This streaming service would be known as HBO Max, and would launch on May 27th, 2020. Of course, this service would include much of Cartoon Network's shows, old and new, but as is custom on top of pre-existing shows, this service would include a lineup of original programs. So we started to see many shows that either started on Cartoon Network or were slated to air on Cartoon Network and were produced by their studio, then get moved to HBO Max, and maybe eventually air on Cartoon Network. Summer Camp Island, which aired its first season on Cartoon Network from 2018 to 2019, would have its second, third, fourth, and fifth seasons dumped on HBO Max, only returning to Cartoon Network for its sixth and final season in 2023. Infinity Train, a show that was hyped from its pilot, would air its first 2 seasons on Cartoon Network, before being moved to HBO Max for its final 2. Take and Seek, HBO Max later reran on Cartoon Network. The Fungies, HBO Max later reran on Cartoon Network. It was clear that Warner was now fully prioritizing streaming over cable, which left the actual channel to feel rather barren around this time, when not many truly original shows running. But these shows did at least have the Cartoon Network name on them, assuring that even if the cable channel died, the brand was not dead. Yet. And hypothetically, making them direct to streaming would allow them to prosper more than they would have had they been cable first, streaming second. Though in 2021, the network itself would start to go through some weird structural changes in order to broaden their audience. In September, they introduced a preschool block called Cartoonito, in a similar vein to Nickelodeon's Nick Jr. and Disney Channel's Disney Jr., that beforehand had been limited to Cartoon Network's foreign counterparts. Cartoon Network had taken a stab at preschool programming before, but not to much success, which to me made this decision seem concerning. I don't know, I just don't feel like preschool programming fits on the network, and seemingly this attempt also failed as the block has progressively been reduced to a smaller and smaller time slot. They also introduced Acme Night on Sunday evenings, a block that sought to target the family with movies and reruns, and it was supposed to have a slate of original shows and movies, including some live-action programming, but most of this proposed content was either cancelled or moved to other platforms, and this block would eventually be moved to Adult Swim as it kept expanding its hours more and more.
Womp 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 womp.
The channel had certainly lost momentum and direction, but it had yet to be enough to where you could confidently declare the brand as dead. Until, well, I think you already know what's coming. Part 4. Warner Brothers Discovery. On April 8th, 2022, Warner Media would merge with Discovery Inc. to form Warner Brothers Discovery. This caused a bit of a management shakeup, and more infamously, in August, HBO Max would remove 36 underperforming titles as a cost-cutting measure, including all 4 of those aforementioned direct-to-streaming CN originals. and even some shows that premiered episodes exclusively on the channel itself. With the exception of Summer Camp Island, this seemed to mean that all these shows were now officially cancelled. And they even went as far as removing some from other streaming platforms and mentions of them from their social medias. Almost like they're trying to completely erase them from history just because they didn't do as well as they wanted them to. And also inevitably another example of corporations ironically encouraging piracy. In October, things only got worse as Cartoon Network Studios would merge with Warner Brothers Animation. Which from a business perspective, yeah, I can see why you'd think having them as two separate studios would be redundant, since both of them had primarily been producing shows for the same platform for years now, but I think it represents the further erasure of Cartoon Network's brand identity. Cartoon Network's main studio mostly produced these wholly original shows that felt like nothing you've ever seen before, and then Warner Brothers brought in these new takes on these old characters and properties. Also, it meant more layoffs. This made people more worried about the channel's future. I mean, who was to say that Warner Bros. Discovery wouldn't soon shut it down completely in another cost-cutting measure? And the fact that we got some reassuring words from their leadership didn't help. Nor did the fact that they actually did a pretty decent job celebrating their 30th anniversary that year. Far better than their 25th anniversary in 2017, which went practically ignored, though still not as good as their 20th anniversary in 2012. They did a good job looking back at their past. Great. Now that seems like that's all they want to do. Part 5. The sad current state. Not counting Adult Swim, Cartoon Network currently only has 8 shows that are still making new episodes. 2 of those are Cartoonito, so disregard those. One of them is a Canadian imported show that started 15 years ago. One of them is from Hanna-Barbera Studios Europe, which was formerly Cartoon Network Studios' European division, and airs its episodes in Europe before the US. 2 of those are from Warner Brothers Animation, both reboots of old shows, one of which has also been running for over a decade, and only 2 of them are from the actual main studio. One of those is a spin-off of a former show, and one of those has been revealed to be on its way out. Gumball has been in limbo for the past 5 years, with it officially ending after its 6th season, but now apparently a 7th season is coming in a year or 2. Despite that it was the creator's decision to end it after 6, which makes me skeptical, and as of now I wouldn't consider it ongoing. The network just has very little going for it nowadays. Just looking at a schedule from today, as of writing this, of the 11 hours Cartoon Network is on before Adult Swim, 80% of the time slots are taken off by ended shows. Adult Swim has been pushed back to starting at the ridiculous hour of 5 p.m. as if starting at 8 p.m. wasn't already stupid enough. The reason for this? On Mondays through Thursdays, for those first 2 hours, Adult Swim airs Checkered Past, a block consisting of a rotation of reruns of Cartoon Network originals from the 90s and 2000s. On Fridays, it's replaced with Toonami Rewind, a block consisting of reruns of some of the more popular shows that used to air on Cartoon Network's anime/action block Toonami. It's well branded and nice to see Cartoon Network finally honor these old shows with their own dedicated programming block again after over a decade, but considering how long people have been asking Cartoon Network to play their old shows since then, the fact that the majority of these shows have now been all made easily available in one place, and that it's been so long that Nickelodeon's beloved retro programming block no longer exists, it really feels like too little too late. I mean, 2 hours consisting of 2 shows. It's nice that they seem to rotate shows in and out on a pretty frequent basis, but still, why not make better use of that time by airing 4 different shows? It's a similar problem that I had with Nickelodeon's various incarnations of their retro programming block, and a problem that didn't really exist in something like Cartoon Planet, which actually did manage to cram a bunch of shows into 1 hour due to it playing individual segments. Though, of course, my biggest question is, why did Adult Swim's hours have to be extended for this? While it is done to appeal to adults, these are all kid-friendly shows. Wouldn't it have made more sense to have it take up those last 2 hours before before Cartoon Network became Adult Swim from 6 to 8, or if you were gonna have it be on Adult Swim, why not have it take up those first 2 hours that Adult Swim already had from 8 to 10? The fact that Adult Swim started at 8 was already ridiculous, since I imagine most kids in Cartoon Network's target audience would not be in bed by then. Though I guess I can't be talking, since I was always forced to go to bed at 8 until around the 5th grade. But, you know, I didn't just immediately go to sleep, I usually stayed up watching TV for a little bit. So to me, that seems like the perfect way to not only please the adults who grew up with these shows when they were first on, but introduce a new generation to these awesome old cartoons. For the kids and young adults who actually still watch live TV, which isn't many. Again, you were a bit late on this. But I guess that kind of brings me to what prompted me to make this video in the first place, which is that recently I went on vacation with my family, and pretty much whenever I had the chance, I was tuning into Cartoon Network, and seeing them rerun their early 2010s hits like Gumball and Regular Show well throughout the day, and their early 2000s classics like Ed, Edd and Eddy and Billy and Mandy in the evening. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed myself. It was kind of nice to get to experience just watching Cartoon Network all day, something I was sort of robbed of as a young lad. These are great shows, but still a part of me couldn't help but be sad to see the network that once felt like it had earned itself the title of Best Place for Cartoons, producing great new originals one after the other while mixing in just enough from Warner Brothers and elsewhere and some reruns, to be reduced to little more than a rerun network, constantly reminding us of the great channel it once was, while having very little going for it in the present and future. This third place network that was once first in my heart now seems to be seeing the same fate as the B-tier networks like Disney XD and Discovery Family, and is in a much more dire state than even Nick and Disney Channel. Nickelodeon seems to be pretty much the same as it has been for years now, just even more reliant on unnecessary reboots and spin-offs of its most popular shows. And Disney Channel actually has picked itself up a little bit by focusing more on what Disney is most known for, you know, animation, albeit to the detriment of its sister network. And both of these are still struggling in terms of ratings in this streaming age, and do share shows with their parent companies' respective streaming apps. So it probably isn't too long before they are shut down completely, but they are still at least still consistently pushing out new content, and I think they as brands have a better chance of living on past the networks themselves than Cartoon Network does. I guess you could say it's like they're returning to their roots, since Cartoon Network started as a reruns channel. But, you know, that was back before reruns became obsolete due to everything becoming streaming based. I don't know, Cartoon Network does have a modest slate of upcoming shows, most of them based on pre-existing IP. It seems like recently we're starting to see shows that are supposed to air on Cartoon Network and have no real reason not to, instead being aired on Adult Swim. In fact, Cartoon Network Studios now feels like it's producing more shows for Adult Swim than it actually is for Cartoon Network. Kind of funny seeing, I remember a few years back when people speculated that Cartoon Network would start putting some of its more mature shows on Adult Swim and save the kiddie crap for the main network, which was only fueled when people actually fell for one of Adult Swim's April Fool's pranks. At the time it seemed ridiculous, but now it's kind of becoming a reality. A far cry from the network that once seemed so unafraid to challenge its young viewers with its content. And of course, a lot of these shows are going to be airing on Max alongside Cartoon Network. We've got more Adventure Time spin-offs, though that show never really left. A Regular Show spin-off, even though I know a lot of people say that that show ended perfectly. And it already went on so long and kind of jumped the shark towards the end. And it's also kind of a bitter reminder that J.D. Quintel's other show, Close Enough, was another victim of the HBO Max purge. While with Adventure Time, it definitely has a big enough world and enough lore to where it could feel like the OG show just barely scratched the surface and there is more room to explore it in further projects. I definitely don't get that idea as much with Regular Show. But hey, if the creator's on board, maybe that means there are more stories to tell. Same with the upcoming Powerpuff Girls reboot. Yeah, they're making another one. for some reason not produced by the main studio. Though this time the original creator's on board, I guess after seeing them screw up his original and most popular creation so many times, he finally caved in and decided this time he'd continue it himself. We also might finally be getting that Adventure Time movie that was announced years ago and has just kind of been in limbo for nearly a decade. But what about that Gumball movie that the creator actually really wanted to make and was supposed to wrap up its story? A story that, unlike Adventure Time and regular show, it has yet to be able to complete. And it was supposed to be on HBO Max, but then Warner Bros. Discovery happened, and now it's also in limbo. And, you know, I think that's something else the cartoon fans of old accidentally predicted. Which is, yeah, now it seems like Cartoon Network is actually becoming way too reliant on reboots of its old properties rather than new original shows. Even if they definitely have a lot more promise and will most likely be much more in line with the originals and more pleasing to the fans, it's still not healthy for a brand to be this reliant on its past. Especially a brand that was once praised for its seemingly never-ending originality. But what can you do besides to look back at your past when you've got no future? So yeah, while it would be technically incorrect to declare Cartoon Network the channel, and even the brand, truly dead at this point, it is on life support, and it's only a matter of time before that does come to fruition. As time passes and more promising new shows get the shaft, with more and more reruns and reboots in their place, with the brand becoming more and more of a second thought, seen as interchangeable with Warner Brothers' other animation divisions by the higher-ups. Its formerly strong brand identity has already been killed, and it's only a matter of time before the channel shuts down, and the brand completely absorbed into the bigger Warner Brothers media conglomerate. Or heck, maybe it'll be completely taken over by Adult Swim. That seems like the logical progression, as that's the part of the channel that seems to be their biggest priority right now, and to be honest, seems like it has been for years now. Regardless, it'll leave behind a legacy of a channel that once was the king of quality and creativity in both children's cartoons and children's television. And when that day does come, fans everywhere will mourn the loss of a network that brought them so much joy over the years, a network that once felt like it could do no wrong, now just another victim of corporate greed and the streaming age. Well, that was depressing. I don't really have much of a positive spin to put on this. Yeah, cable is dead, Cartoon Network is dead, Warner Bros. Discovery sucks. This was the Cartoon Koala, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.